This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson. Yes, hello. This is your host, Harry Wilkinson, and welcome once again, I hope, to the Spirit and Wellness Show. Or if this is your first time listening, welcome to the show. This is the show where we take a look at the days, weeks, events, happenings in the world of politics, happenings internationally, in technology, science, entertainment, and we take it all a step back and we look at it from a higher perspective. What do I mean by a higher perspective? Well, a higher perspective from my point of view is a metaphysical or a spiritual perspective in which we recognize the truth of who and what we are, and we recognize that these situations, these stories that play out are illusory. They're illusions. They're illusions, but they're very powerful illusions that we create ourselves so that we can get immersed in them, learn from them, and, experience all sorts of different feelings and thoughts through them. And ultimately to reaffirm, reconnect to our essential oneness, or become more aware of that. That in a nutshell is my perspective on these things. So I find it helpful to focus on this, when we deal with news that is particularly, and actually most news is geared to be very jolting, very off-putting, very button pushing, and it's geared to do that because the media outlets that present the news to you need to have your ratings. They need to have high ratings. They need to have those ratings so that they can make money, because the entire news industry, the traditional news industry, is tied to that. And so, what are they going to do? They're going to find stories of shock value to present to you. But the good thing is that from on a spiritual perspective or a higher perspective, any of these stories, doesn't matter what story it is, any of these stories are powerful tools that you can dive into, take energy from, get an understanding from, and reaffirm, reconnect to truth. You can see the illusions behind them, and you can see how clever the creation is. So it's a healthy way to deal with things that may not feel so healthy, if you will. All right, this week we're going to take a look at, we're going to go back and continue our discussion on consciousness that we began at the end of last week's program. And specifically from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is an organization that was created by an astronaut. And he passed away recently. We did a special episode of the show on this topic, but this astronaut was on the Apollo was it 13 mission? I think it. Let me just look. I think it was Apollo. It was one of the Apollo missions that he was on. I think with John Glenn. I'm sorry, it was Apollo 14. My apologies. But anyway, gentleman's name Edgar Mitchell. One of the early astronauts in the 70s that walked on the moon. And he created the Institute of Noetic Sciences after he had a very interesting experience coming back from the moon. Now, he had always been, sort of interested in the connection of the body and the mind and psychic abilities and things of that nature. And he, in fact, worked for a while with, I believe it was Edgar Cayce, on psychic abilities and seeing if he could, while he was in space, read certain cards and other images with his mind. But in any case, the experience that he had coming back from the moon was one in which he had I guess you could call it a breakthrough in consciousness. On the noetic.org website, when they talk about this, they say he was filled with an inner conviction as certain as any mathematical equation he'd ever solved. He knew that the beautiful blue world to which he was returning is part of a living system, harmonious and whole, and that we all participate, as he expressed it later, in a universe of consciousness. And the experience radically altered his worldview. And he realized that although science had developed great technological achievements, science had not really even begun to look at the deep mysteries of the universe and consciousness itself, which is true. I mean, there's still relatively little research on consciousness, let alone an understanding of what consciousness is. But as, and I think what will turn the tide on that is that as we begin to develop what everybody's interested in, what most of the tech people are interested in, is developing AI, artificial intelligence. And as we develop artificial intelligence, they're going to want to know what consciousness is, and they're going to want to be investigating that. So that will probably spur a lot more investigation into it, but up until now, there hasn't been much. But anyway, Captain Mitchell's belief was that the uncharted territory of the human mind was the next frontier to explore, and that there were possibilities there that we hadn't even begun to imagine. And so 2 years after he came back from his space mission, he created the Institute of Noetic Sciences in 1973. And the Noetic Sciences, if you don't know, Noetic comes from the Greek, which means inner wisdom, direct knowing, or subjective understanding. And the term Noetic Sciences, was coined by Edgar Mitchell. After he had that experience, which by the way is referred to as a samadhi experience, in which he says the presence of divinity became almost palpable, and I knew that life in the universe was not just an accident based on random processes, and that knowledge came to me. So the work that Noetic Sciences does is research on areas of the brain that involve consciousness, and research in parapsychology as well, psychic ability, all of these things. And you can go to their website, noetic.org, and learn all about them, and take a look at their extensive library of articles and research and all of the work that they do. But in any case, last week we were talking about one particular article in their blog section called Consciousness and the New Paradigm. And it fit really well into, what I've focused the show on, which is what I call the transition era. What they're calling the new paradigm, I think, is essentially the same thing as the transition era that I talk about. This transition era that we are living in now is a time when there's this shift happening in awareness, but also in very concrete ways where we are seeing rapid changes in attitudes in politics and breakthroughs in health and science. We have, social awareness that is burgeoning on issues like income inequality and things like the Black Lives Matter movement and the Arab Spring, which began with a real energetic and hopeful energy and has been pushed back severely, but it's still there. They're still working on it. This transition era we are in seems to be symbolized by a push-pull kind of thing. We take 2 steps forward, we take a couple of steps back. But the changes are happening, and they're happening rapidly. So on this show, I talk about different aspects of what's going on in the transition era. And consciousness, or even an understanding of consciousness, I think is definitely playing a very important part and will continue to play an important part in the transition era we live in. So, last week we talked about this article and how how the shifts are taking place in all of these things that I mentioned, but that a shift in thinking is also occurring, and that really is what drives it all. It's when your consciousness shifts or your awareness shifts. And according to this article, when this shift is completed, it will constitute a deep change in the way we see the universe. So this article here looks at experiments that have been conducted that have pointed to some very important discoveries in consciousness and awareness. So let's see. We stopped. Right, we were talking about this gentleman who wrote the blog, a gentleman by the name of Adrian David Nelson. Was talking about how he had discovered the works of scientists like Dean Radin and Rupert Sheldrake that have really shown how psychic phenomena actually occur through science. Now, Dean Radin is very controversial. You can look him up on Wikipedia or anything like that. And there's always a cadre of scientists that try to shoot him down. But his science is good, and they really don't have any basis upon which to, bring him down, except to, accept their own skepticism and inability to accept the science that he has, conducted. But in any case, that's a discussion for another time. So he says, over nearly 3 decades, experiments conducted by researchers at Princeton University revealed that when people direct their attention to a physical random system, the outputs will often shift in line with their intentions. Outside any ordinary physical contact, The reported effect seems to reconcile within any materialist understanding of mind. Other research exploring this mysterious mind-matter interconnection found that a network of random systems located all around the planet mysteriously respond to collective shifts in attention of entire populations. The Global Consciousness Project, led by psychologist Roger Nelson, found that when dramatic world events occur and millions of minds respond with similar emotions, strange patterns of order emerge in the data. Where attention goes, order mysteriously flows. So yeah, the Global Consciousness Project, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. It is something that Princeton has initiated to sort of get meaningful correlations in human consciousness data. And using scientists and engineers, they gathered data from a global network of random number generators in 70 sites around the world. And they were trying to look at the correlations that might reflect the presence and activity of consciousness in the world when major global events occur that everyone hears about. So, we've talked a lot about on this show, a lot about how when these major events occur that everyone looks at and everyone sort of participates in a way, there's a connection or a reaffirming of our oneness, of our sense of connectedness. And that these events happen, or we create these events to happen, to help us, experience that, reaffirm that. And I think a lot of what the Global Consciousness Project is doing is actually giving concrete science to this idea. So let me go back and continue with this blog here. So Mr. Nelson, Adrian David Nelson, continues on to say that perhaps equally surprising to me was the deeper views of consciousness are increasingly expressed by mainstream scientists and philosophers. Believe it or not, a leading theory of consciousness in mainstream neuroscience today, integrated information theory, is actually a form of panpsychism, in which the fundamental information underlying the physical world has both an objective and subjective pole. Consciousness, as the theory goes, is matter viewed from within. Fascinating. Today, world-renowned philosophers such as David Chalmers and Freya Matthews, Thomas Nagel, and Galen Strawson tell us that Western science has profoundly overlooked the significance of consciousness, and that its origins lie not in us, but in a fundamental interior quality of the world. So consciousness is not just this subjective thing. It is something we're part of. And they argue that science's external mapping of nature both implies and requires an interior qualitative dimension that grounds it in reality. In other words, consciousness. The self-realizing, self-referential qualities unique to consciousness may also be necessary to explaining why anything at all exists. So he goes on to say that other physicists and cosmologists are saying similar things. He mentions Paul Davies, who is among a number of thinkers who argue that the astonishing fine-tuning of the universe, which has permitted the evolution of complex observers, cannot be adequately explained by summary referral to the multiverse. Now that's a lot of words there, but what he means is that the interaction of, and the idea of the multiverse, by the way, is that there are multiple universes existing at the same time that are interconnected. So what Davies is arguing is that the universe may actually require the evolution of life and mind. Interesting. And then Andre Linde, celebrated physicist, he quotes him as saying, avoiding the concept of consciousness in quantum cosmology may lead to an artificial narrowing of our outlook. So, scientists are starting to wake up to the idea of an evolution of consciousness. So, what does it all mean for us? Well, why is this growing openness to deeper views of consciousness, as I argue, among the most profound shifts now occurring for our species? The answer, I think, is that consciousness is ultimately who we really are, the truth of who we are. As I always say, who and what we really are, which is oneness. There is a profound and consequential distinction between the old materialist view, in which we are isolated fragments of illusory experience and doomed in the meaningless universe, and the now emerging view, in which we are, each of us, truly conscious participators in an ongoing unfoldment of cosmic creativity. That's what it's about. We are these conscious participators. Well, we're not quite conscious of being participators in many senses, but we are participating. Our modern seeking is revealing a profound new picture of consciousness, not dissimilar to that described by mystics for millennia. We are learning that consciousness is real and intimately bound up with the world. In a universe in which consciousness is intrinsic to nature's workings, we can see ourselves as invested into a larger matrix of meaning that transcends and includes our lives. The emerging view may not only shed light on some of the most enduring mysteries of modern science and philosophy, it offers, I think, a unifying and catalyzing vision in which we are all life, in which we and all life are truly in this together, an integral part of a larger cosmic process. We, in our core identity, are the universe coming to know itself. That, for me, changes everything. And well, that's what it's all about, folks. That's really what it's all about. It's this growing awareness of our connectedness, our oneness, that we are in this together, and not only that we're in this together, but that we're creating everything that we are experiencing on a level that we may or may not be, consciously aware of or even believe exists. But that is the truth of who and what we are. And it's a very good article. I really highly recommend going over to noetic.org and taking a look around. There's a lot of fascinating things there. Like this Global Consciousness Project is really interesting stuff. And to know what the subtle but real effects of consciousness are, and using science to do that, is really an amazing thing. And their basic hypothesis is that the global events that engage hearts and minds will lead to some sort of structure of this consciousness data. So that's over at Noosphere, noosphere.princeton.edu. You can take a look at that. And it's really getting exciting in a lot of these areas. People are everyday people. You don't have to be woo woo, new age kind of person to start to really understand some of these things that the as he says, the mystics and gurus have been talking about for centuries, and now we have a more concrete understanding of them, I think, and we have science actually looking at these things and finding new ways to explore them. So this is where, and I'm going to show on this a couple weeks ago, this is where science and spirituality interconnect. And that, I think, is another hallmark of this transition era. You're going to see and hear more about science and spirituality connecting and supporting each other. And I think that we're also moving away from the idea of spirituality as being a religious thing. I think religions and spirituality have major differences. The basic difference is that religion or organized religions are organizations. Unlike spirituality, which is, I say, a human trait. We all have a spiritual nature inside, I believe. We all have sort of a hardwire, certainly genetically, with the VMAT2 gene, which I've spoken of, which is the gene that sort of gives us the ability to transcend and feel part of something bigger. And we also have in our brain, the right frontal lobe, which is the center of where we have these experiences of connecting and prayer and consciousness and all of these things. So, and we know as science has shown that when certain parts of the brain are damaged, these other parts take over and allow you to think and behave in more different creative ways. So fascinating stuff, and we'll talk. We'll always be coming back to this sort of topic. It's a fascinating idea, and as more things occur in the world, obviously, more more things will be available to talk about. So now, again, at the website there is noetic.org, and you might want to also look at the IONS blog. That's where you'll find this article. So that is my take on consciousness in the transition era. As I say, we'll come back to doing that later on. But let's leave you with some wellness tips for our upcoming Easter holiday. What sorts of things should you be looking at to cook at home? If you have certain issues, Easter is a time when lots of people get together. Families get together, and so one of the things that often happens is that we eat too much, And we'll look more in next week's program about things to stay away from, depending on what it is you're trying to deal with. If you have things like high blood pressure, diabetes, there are ways to cook things, and there are things to eat that you can really focus on, particularly eating at home. Because eating at home allows you to have greater control over what you're putting into your mouth. If you're going out to restaurants to eat, while it may be fun, you do put your health at risk because you don't know exactly what is going into the food. And there's an interesting book that we'll talk about next week, or when we're back on the air. Andrew Weil has written. It's called Fast Food, Good Food. It's about cooking at home for people who don't have a lot of time, which is probably most of us. So we'll talk more about, cooking and how we can find ways to increase our health by cooking at home. But until then, it's time to wrap the show. And keep looking at the world through new eyes. Keep becoming aware. That's what it's all about. Awareness.